quick comment. Sound check. Okay, we've got things under control. We're going to read a comment, random comment. Marshall McLuhan converted to Catholicism after writing about the effect of new media upon the mind. The printing press was, for instance, connected to realistic drawings in perspective, before which the famous artists who discovered perspective and the vanishing point had to use a device to project lines onto a canvas to reveal the vanishing point. And before printed word, most could neither write nor read without voicing aloud the writing. Very few men could read silently, and to read and write at all, they would have a certain cadence, pentameter, poetry, the flow of the Bible, etc. Same as no culture without a written language can produce architecture. They may have a set of huts they can draw from, but they cannot design a new building. Only repeat an established structure, TP, etc. This had something to do with the part of the brain that manages proportion and ratios and projects them spatially. This is an interesting point, and it goes back to something I've said about we'll say Norse culture prior to Charlemagne, is that there was a writing system, there was a futhark, and it was used for inscriptions, engravings, mostly dedicated to people who had died, on these rune stones. There was no papyrus. There was no, at that time, sheepskin, goatskin was not used for parchment. And so the only time the Norse used the runes was in these rune stones. And most of the rune stones say, well, it's either sort of a grave marker or it's sort of telling about maybe, some kind of Norse name. I don't know. Mr. Viking went to Byzantium. There he served in the army and died after many adventures. Very short, not even paragraph length. Maybe not even really sentences necessarily. So they did have a writing system, and they knew how to write and read. This is something that was not exclusive to like a priest class, that would interpret Bibles and things like that. The mythology of the Norse was oral. The Eddas were oral. Only much later did they actually get written down. So there was a lot of the structure of Norse religion that was oral and not written, but they did have a conception that the runes held power and that the runes would be used on rune stones in special occasions, and people could read and they could write these runes without, living in a cloister for their whole life, without living in a monastery and going through the education of Greek and Latin. This is something that people knew how to read and write. Now, was it everybody? Or how exactly did that work? The runes are very simple, and the aesthetics of them are very clear-cut. They are obviously made for stone carving, because it's a lot of straight lines, which if you're carving stone, much easier to do a straight line than a circle. So, that's interesting because they also did not have stone structures. They did not have castles, which we think of as typically Northern European, but they did not have castles. They had Stonehenge, so they knew how to move stones around. They knew how to stack stones on top of each other in prehistoric times. But the Vikings were not making castles. They were not constructing brick buildings. What they had were halls, and these halls would be constructed of wood. And, occasionally some, other sorts of structures. But whether these were two-story or not, well, you can always throw a loft in there. You can throw an attic in there. But none of these were really permanent structures in the way that we see the Colosseum or the Acropolis. So it is interesting to say something like written language and architecture have some kind of symbolic or neural connection, that these two are related psychologically. When you look at the example of the Norse, that they, theoretically with prehistoric precedents of Stonehenge, with the knowledge, they knew what the Greeks and Romans were doing to the south. They had traveled there. So they knew what was going on. They just had no desire. They knew how to read and write, but they really had no desire to create a written culture. Most of their culture, most of their mythology was oral, and the rune stones were a very rare occurrence. Yes, now there are hundreds of them littered around Sweden and Norway and Denmark and Germany and Finland. There's hundreds of them. And there's even runic inscriptions in places like Greece or Turkey and some of these places that the Vikings would go and serve as mercenaries. They would carve rune stones wherever they went. So they were a literate culture. They were a literate people, even as a warrior people, even as, the Chad Viking. Clearly not a nerdy culture, but they were into reading and writing. They just didn't use it very often. So it's a very interesting example. I'd love to hear what the commenter thinks about this. Not that they're going to see this video, but maybe someone else can chime in and pick that thread up. McLuhan's main thesis is the medium is the message. It matters not at all what is played on TV or what is written about. These mediums extend humans, like the grinding stone extended the human molar teeth to pre-chew grain into flour, and change the method the brain combines symbolic data from the various senses. No matter what, the medium is the thing that changes people, not the messages coming over it. Modernity, where there is a modal existence. Okay, that's not a sentence, but modernity is a modal existence. White picket fence and any random TV is as good as another because of the interchangeable parts and the product assembly line making copies of copies without originals. This term copy without original has a specific term. Simulacrum, I think, is well, now this is all about how to copy video games. Google, you're not being helpful. Simulacrum is the correct word. Simulacrum, copy without. A painting is created by copying a photograph. A copy of a copy without an original. So this is Baudrillard, Jean Baudrillard, the postmodern French sociologist, simulacra and simulacrum. And the Gulf War did not take place. That's interesting. Okay, so he would be one to read more into concerning, I guess, this modal nature of... this is interesting. The idea that the Iraq War did not take place because it was not a struggle, it was just a massacre. That's interesting. The myth of Trojan War. Okay, we're getting off topic here. But that is interesting. Copies without originals. No example of a T model is the real TV. All are copies. So this is sort of like the inversion of Platonism, that you have like a perfect chair or a perfect body or a perfect state or a perfect whatever. And there's like this Platonic realm where all these perfect forms exist. And then we, through our creativity, imagination, hard work, we try to create, we try to manifest the art. And it's always imperfect, but we're always referring to these perfect forms. This is kind of... by modal, I think the word modal here is used to mean that there is no hierarchy. In Platonism, there is a pure hierarchy, where at the top you have the perfect form, the perfect world of forms, and then below that apex, you have various manifestations which approximate the perfect form. So you have the apex, world of forms, and then manifestation, all the way down to very crude stick figures, very crude representations. Whereas a modal existence is there is no hierarchy, there is no apex, there is no perfect thing, there is no world of forms. Everything is in itself. Everything is radically separated. There is no overarching metaphysics to construct a hierarchy. There are many different metaphysics, and each artist has his own metaphysic. And you can't really compare apples to oranges. You can't. There's no ability to make judgments, because there's nothing to judge in reference to. There's nothing in respect to what, right? We can't say, well, this is good or bad because the Bible says so, because the Bible is equal to, the writing on the bathroom wall. So when we're getting into this kind of theory, this is, I think, what is meant by modality, which gets into art as imitating life, life imitating art, and finally, life imitating art that imitates nothing at all. And now you are in post-modernity where nothing is anything, make your own existence, which, is hearkening back to Nietzsche. You have to create your own value, and then Aleister Crowley, do what thou wilt. First order symbol is a drawing of an eagle representing an eagle that you saw. Second order is using an eagle as the emblem of the Air Force, not referring to an actual eagle. And finally, the eagle has landed is not talking about eagles at all, but a moon landing. This is the precession of simulacra. Then there's the difference between virtual, emulative, and simulative. I honestly couldn't tell you. Those all sound like synonyms to me. Virtual, like virtual reality, a fake reality, which is not real. Emulative and emulation, referring to something, and then simulative, that which simulates something. Yeah, I guess I understand maybe the difference between a simulation is meant to create a false reality, whereas emulation is referring to a real reality, and then virtual, I don't know the paradigm. Someone's going to have to explain that to me. The end, accordingly, is hypermodernity, hypertext, and the internet, according to McLuhan, would reorder our perceptions and how they combine in the brain to bring about digital tribalism. Terence McKenna discussed it in the trialogues amongst all the standard Essalon, Laurel Canyon, CIA BS that FBI informant spouts. Hadn't heard of this digital tribalism. So digital tribalism, I guess, is the marketing term referring to how you have many different niche tribes. You have the goth people and the emo people and the goth emo crossover people and the people who are into heavy metal and death metal and punk metal and punk rock and all of this splitting. So there's a kind of tribalism. So there is a McLuhan Galaxy website and WordPress. McLuhan was the person who coined the term global village to characterize our new wired world. Today we often load the phrase with idyllic or utopian connotations that McLuhan did not intend. Quite the contrary. In a 1977 interview on Ontario TV, the host asks, way back in the early 50s, you predicted that the world was becoming a global village. We have global consciousness, and I'm wondering, do you think that is happening right now? McLuhan says McManus says, it seems, McLuhan, that this tribal world is not friendly. McLuhan says, oh no, tribal people, one of their main kinds of sports is butchering each other. It's a full-time sport in tribal societies. McManus, but I had some idea that as we got global and tribal, we were going to try to, and McLuhan says, the closer you get together, the more you like each other. There's no evidence of that in any situation that we've ever heard of. When people get close together, they get more and more savage, impatient with each other. The global village is a place of very arduous interfaces and very abrasive situations. So that's, I guess, the opposite of the way that digital tribalism is used as a marketing term. The idea of a global village bringing people into kind of tribal conflict. Central to McLuhan's scheme are tribal and literate social modes. Pre-literate cultures were tribal. They inhabited a sensual, dynamic, non-linear world, the implicit magical world of the resonant oral word, encountering not efficient causes, but formal causes of configurational field. Reality was taken in through all five senses with emphasis on oral communication, and concepts such as individualism and privacy were not merely foreign, they were inconceivable. And in fact, I would add to that they were sinful, that to be part of a tribe and say, I'm an individual, or to say, don't get in my business, this is private, that would be conceived of as sinful. And now it's seen as sinful to sin against individualism, to invade privacy, because privacy is viewed as a weapon, and so the invasion of privacy is viewed as disarming the person, because we are all engaged in activities which we would like to be private, as opposed to the tribal world. But then the phonetic alphabet and the printing press detribalized Western culture, imposed linear thought, a reliance on sight at the expense of the other more interactive senses. Now, interesting point by Camille Paglia, is that the Western artistic tradition has always been more visual than any other world tradition. So that I think there is a predisposition that the West has to a visual tradition over every other. I mean, if you agree with Paglia or Paglia and her mentor Howard Bloom, who just died, and they have this thesis that the Western tradition is the pinnacle of visual tradition, that is more visual than any other culture. I, of course, take that in a class analysis of saying Western culture is more of a warrior culture than any other culture, and therefore, for the warrior, the visual is primal. The visual is prime. For the priest, it is the word, and for the merchant, it is the money, the resource, the abstract wealth, social status, something like that. But for the warrior, it is visuality and the visual which is primary. So, whereas other cultures were more enwrapped by, a mercantile or a priestly aspect, that the Western culture always had this supreme visual aspect to it, an aesthetic aspect that you see going back to ancient Egypt, maybe the Minoans, maybe other prehistoric cave art of the Neanderthals in Europe, something like that. So I think Western culture was already predisposed to this kind of what is he saying here? The reliance on sight at the expense of other senses. I think the West was predisposed to that prior to the printing press or the phonetic alphabet, which the phonetic alphabets of the world, the earliest ones, we would say, sometimes people say the Phoenician. Now, we do have new evidence coming out of the ancient Balkans that prior to the Phoenicians, there was a writing system in the ancient Balkans. Not a lot of research has been done into that because this is recent archaeology, and you have so many entrenched, fields of anthropology and prehistory and archaeology that are going to say the Phoenicians, the Phoenicians, the Phoenicians. But now we have new evidence in the last, 10, 20 years that actually an older Balkan culture had an alphabet long before, thousands of years before the Phoenicians. But in any case, we are talking about Western Eurasia when we talk about the invention of alphabets, and we are also talking about Western Eurasia when we talk about Western culture, when we talk about all of these groups. So to continue, there was a reliance on individualism and its corollary isolation, and a kind of emotional anesthetic upon civilized humanity, creatures crude and numbed to their perceptions, compared with the hyperesthesia of oral and auditory cultures. Over the centuries, tribal man became Western man. Electronic media, McLuhan argued, were having a retribalizing effect on culture. From the Playboy interview, the electronically induced technological extensions of our central nervous system, which I spoke of earlier, are immersing us in a whirlpool of information movement, and thus are enabling man to incorporate within himself the whole of mankind. The aloof and dissociated role of the literate man of the Western world is succumbing to the new, intense depth participation engendered by the electronic media, and bringing us back in touch with ourselves as well as one another. But the instant nature of electric information movement is decentralizing rather than enlarging the family of man into a new state of multitudinous tribal existences. Particularly in countries where literate values are deeply institutionalized, this is a highly traumatic process, since the clash of the old segmented visual culture and the new integral electronic culture creates a crisis of identity, a vacuum of the self which generates tremendous violence. Violence that is simply an identity quest, private or corporate, social or commercial. This is 20 years before the World Wide Web, and he nailed it. Western man is metamorphizing into electronic man. When a person finds himself, well, it says herself, oh McLuhanites, oh McLuhan Galaxy. I guess this is a feminist publication. Herself. When a person finds himself alone in a strange town or new city, he will be drawn towards, okay, I guess we're just, feminism, you win. Feminists, you win. When a person finds herself alone in a strange town or new city, she will be drawn towards places that interest her, to people she finds amicable or fascinating. We do this in almost any scenario. We know it practically a priori. But this tendency takes on a new social dimension once we eliminate distance as a factor. A community once necessarily had to refer to a group of people living reasonably close in proximity to each other. Today, any group of people, regardless of geographic dispersion, with a shared interest in a spot in cyberspace where they can relay and receive messages can become a community. Thus, 100 people with a mean distance of 250 miles between them and a mutual interest in, say, artisanal dental floss or the cartoon Brave Star, can now become the artisanal dental floss community and the Brave Star fandom. Fans have been around for decades. The advent of the fandom, however, was contingent upon the internet. Read the rest of this article, and they give a link here. Oh, this is from BeyondEasy.net. So maybe Beyond Easy, they are the feminists here. Okay. This might be a much longer article than we initially had meant to read. Okay. Let's see. Tribalism. Where were we? Let's search for herself. Okay, herself. Okay. Take, for example, the Street Fighter community, a subdivision of the fighting game community. The stranger in a new place scenario was more or less the experience of the Web 1.0 generation during the decade or so prior to the colonization of cyberspace. It was visible even during the Web 1.0 days. People who were interested in something created web content pertaining to it. Other people who are interested in the same thing viewed and passed along the material. This is a facet of new tribalism, membership in communities that aren't bound to geographical region yet. And then there's a link to another one, the tribalizing of America, landslide counties. Okay, so that is referring to Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point or Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. Landslide counties, moving to extremes. Online sampling. Okay, so that's a very brief little article there about politics. Between the ages of 14 and 17, I was a huge Marilyn Manson fan. My people, my tribe were the other maladjusted teen goths on the internet. This is an innocuous example, but ISIS is a less innocuous example. The social organism of the detribalized West was the nation-state. The rise of European nationalism was a direct consequence of the printing press. The nation-state and liberal democracy are social configurations whose emergence was concomitant with the mass production and proliferation of vernacular print matter and increasing literacy rates. Languages become standardized across ethnic zones, expanding regional identity to national identity. Literate culture reified the notion of the individual, which was a prerequisite for any consideration of individual rights. Today, electronic media is undermining the social organization of print culture. This is, I guess, by Robert Reich. Tribalism is tearing America apart. Democrats and the GOP no longer share the same basic value, and the nation of America is dead. So that's, I'm not sure I want to read an article by Robert Reich, though. So we're going to go over to the other article. The loose ties of citizenship are increasingly superseded by the stronger and more exigent bonds of digitally connected and reinforced subgroups. The polarization of politics is merely the surface effect of the tribalization tectonics. Yet post-literacy is quite a different mode of interdependence from pre-literacy. McLuhan is correct. He predicted the alphabet would be altogether phased out by television and newer electronic media, which obviously hasn't been the case, but hypertext is not the same as print, and the real-time global proliferation of manipulable mixed media digital information has a manifold of practical points of contact with oral tribal societies. And then we've got Justine Sacco, political polarization and media. Consistent liberals have a variety of sources. Consistent conservatives are centered around Fox News. Liberals defriend people because of politics. Conservatives are more likely to have friends with different political opinions on Facebook. Liberals trust more than they distrust 28 of 36 news sources. Conservative distrust more than trust 24 of the 36 news sources, so they're almost opposite in their trust versus mistrust. Sharing common ground. Consistent liberals and consistent conservatives are likely to drive political discussion. They lead rather than listen, and they talk about politics more overall. Okay, so this is just political analysis. How long ago? This is from 2014. This is pretty old, not really important. This is interesting. So liberals trust BuzzFeed the most. Trust levels of news sources by ideological group. Consistent liberals trust The Economist, more trusted than distrusted, more distrusted than trusted. Okay, so they trust The Economist, they trust Fox News to an extent. They do not trust BuzzFeed. So BuzzFeed is the least trusted news source. Ed Schultz is not trusted. Who else? Daily Show. Okay, so it's just showing that there's more red in the graph than there is. I don't know. You can't see the graph, so me narrating the graph is not a good use of time, right? So there's 8 pages of this. That's amazing. Okay, well, we don't want to read 8 pages of that. Let's just get back to the article. Commenters lay the responsibility for polarized politics of the digital century upon the filter bubble, a concept espoused by Eli Pariser. Your filter bubble is the personal universe of information that you live in online, unique and constructed just for you by the array of personalized filters that now power the web. Facebook contributes things to Read and Friends status updates. Google personally tailors your search queries. Yahoo News and Google News tailor your news. It's a comfortable place, the filter bubble. By definition, it's populated by the things that most compel you to click. The algorithms only push us toward places and people we were probably already heading towards. But it also means you're more likely to have to go out of your way to find material that doesn't simply reinforce your worldview. We're seeing groups of people coming to inhabit narrative worlds that might be incongruous or contradictory to those of other groups, making more salient the divisions of those in certain group and those outside of the group. Now, all of this, the problem with all of this is that there is now a consistent effort on the part of Facebook, Google, YouTube to promote mainstream opinions and to censor opinions they don't like. So all of this, let's skip back up to the top. This was September 12th, 2015. So not a very, not necessarily correct, this article. But certainly this was a thesis that was out there. How do people get radicalized, right? So we're gonna go back to Connor Wood. We're evolved to be tribal animals. It makes sense that living in a strong tribe would make us feel warm and fuzzy, but the stronger our tribes get, the more outsiders look like aliens or enemies. Ritual per se doesn't produce this effect, but instead piggybacks and intensifies it. The result is that religious people are more likely to be parochial, local-minded, and suspicious of outsiders. In its extreme manifestations, this dynamic produces religious wars. Enlightenment and humanistic values tend to look at strong in-group bonds and ritual and to preference universalistic values that shatter tribal boundaries. Post-tribal value systems may be the naughty root of the religious science schism. Just like religious piggybacks on our tribal tendencies, science historically piggybacks on our anti-tribal instincts, valorizing a culture-free, objective picture of reality and making many scientists coolly suspicious of ritual, religion, and tribal identifiers. But this anti-tribal worldview comes with a price. Secular countries have higher suicide rates. Many of the ills of modern society, alienation, loneliness, frayed social fabric, are good candidates for symptoms of our rejection of small groups. Wood's observations of the dysphorias of modern life rather echo some of McLuhan's unflattering assessments of the Gutenberg human. In the first paragraph, he mentions ritual as a tribal intensifier. Earlier in the piece, he describes in some detail what ritual means. Ritual is the coordinated, stereotyped action of human bodies that demonstrates and inspires allegiance to a group. By participating in the ritual practices of the group, these researchers argue, you're communicating that you accept the group's basic moral framework, that you're agreeing to behave according to its standards, and perhaps most importantly, that you promise to be loyal to its members. In the digital tribalism, this needn't be an elaborate or even a literal song and dance. A retweet, a like, a reblog will usually do. Employing a hashtag can be the functional equivalent of flashing a gang sign. There is no hyperbole here. Think about what we're doing when we use the Black Lives Matter or Gamergate hashtags. Look above, communicating that you accept a group's moral framework, agreeing to behave accordingly to the group's standards, promising to be loyal to its members. You probably wouldn't designate these as reasons why you're using the hashtag, but if you asked a Christian why he gets together with other Christians and sing hymns on Sunday morning, he's just as unlikely to frame his reply in the language of group psychology. But in terms of integrating ourselves with groups, or integrating ourselves with groups by participating in activities endemic to that group, both serve the same basic purpose. In the case of the digital group, these rituals consist of putting forth signifiers in an arena that is wholly and dynamically semiotic. In the digital sphere, we exist to each other as different flavors, textures, and shades of symbolic meaning. We meet and deal with each other not as corporeal human beings, but as variegated abstractions and images. And then they post a little picture of Alessandro Bruschetti's Sintesi, or maybe it's Sintesi Fascista, so which is some modern futurist art where you have, it's a triptych, and on the left you have black flags and black shirts with men in black helmets raising their swords. Then you have Mussolini in the middle with 3 different heads, waves of grain, airplanes, modern battleships, and then the last one, black shirts with armaments. So that's an interesting little fascist reference there. I'm on Facebook. I don't like it. It's where all my meat space friends live now. I use Twitter, which is where I'm made most conscious of having one foot on either side of the widening fault line between print culture and digital culture. I don't use Twitter. Okay, that's great. Today, some parts of Tumblr have become somewhat of a base for things like groupthink, the glorification of internet celebrity culture, and discussions about contentious topics that can become traumatic. When described like this, it actually sounds a lot like the real world, but aren't online interactions part of the real world? Aren't the interactions and communications we have part of the same time-space plane that we are also on? I think it is problematic that social groups continue to delineate a distinction between online and real world, as though there is a binary between the earthly and the technical. A binary like inside-outside needs to be interrogated because it perpetuates ideas that invalidate and undermine movements and interactions that happen online as just as lonely, friendless, going nowhere types do to pass the time. It is also uncritically lets things slide, a separation between nature and humans as though both are separate things. Okay, so I might want to skip to the end. What is the conclusion? I'm going to skip the rest. I don't think there is a conclusion. I think it is just a whole lot of stuff. And McLuhan. Okay, so we've read most of the article. And let's see. Beyond humanism, shaming racists. This is interesting. Keep your school all American. While there have been institutional efforts at combating racist attitudes, the most frequently used tool has been shaming. Racist is only slightly less toxic than pedophile. Racists are embarrassed to be called racist. White racism continues to stain the United States social fabric. So this person is asking how to end racism. Science and behavior. Third, effective punishment. If you spray a hydrophobic cat. Punishment. Thought exercise. Let's imagine what happens when we shame a racist. We're reluctant to empathize with someone who holds odious beliefs. A behavior analysis. Let's start with the racist. Okay, is there going to be any point? I mean, what do you do? Are you going to give me a shock therapy, dude? People with racial prejudices reinforce each other. Shaming a racist. The formulation of new habits. Changing outward but not inward behavior. Punishment, blah, blah, blah. Okay, shaming usually fails to change attitudes. The typical social media savvy progressive resembles the tough on crime politicians of the 1980s and 1990s. The principle is the same. Social environment has generated an epidemic of deleterious behavior, and the preferred solution is to come down hard on violators instead of intervening such that the social environment produces fewer of them. A progressive who believes that the way to deal with a racist is to divest him of his income and send him into exile with a brand on his face differs little from a Reagan-era Republican who believes the way to deal with a drug dealer is to lock him up for 40 years. Progressives have the acuity to recognize that the scourge of violent crime is best solved by actions and policy that emphasize positive reinforcement, which is not necessarily true. I think mostly just introducing marijuana, pornography. So I don't think this person is just saying that shaming is not a good tactic. They don't really say what you should do. But that's an interesting little blog there. So we've got that. We've got the McLuhan Galaxy. We did a little McLuhan today. We read a little bit of McLuhan. We got a little bit into that. Reading some random comments. You know how it is. Terence McKenna. I've also heard of Terence McKenna. This is, to me, I read this and I'm like, is this John David Ebert? It's not John David Ebert. It's not John David Ebert. And, you know, when I first heard of John and I started watching John, I said, this guy is the only guy talking about this. But apparently not. Apparently, if you are even slightly in the left, then you've heard of this before. Oh, Terence McKenna, you know what? He did, Ebert did an interview with Terence McKenna. I remember his face. I remember what he looks like. And this is interesting. His theory of evolution, the stoned ape. Any reference to Ebert in this? Unfortunately not. I guess McKenna was. I guess Ebert's not going to show up there in the Wikipedia. But Terence McKenna discussed this in the trilogues among all the standard Essalon. I don't know what Essalon is. Essalon? Laurel Canyon? Laurel Canyon, Los Angeles. Indigenous people, counterculture. Okay. Interesting. CIA stuff. Okay, so apparently this guy doesn't like Terence McKenna necessarily. But that's interesting. That is very interesting. McLuhan, interesting guy. All right, so we're going to take a look at some talk about Junger. Junger's promotion of suffering speaks to me. Encourage people to read Junger. Okay. All right. Well, I don't discourage people from reading, you know, and I wanna for a second to hear what's going on. So let's switch over here. Let's see what's going on. Oh, we're muted. Okay, so people are saying that's based. Okay. All right. Well, that's not a substantive comment, so I think we're going to end it there, and we will, I guess, end this video. It's always hard to end. It's always hard to end a good video. I think I did some reading. I don't read books, but you know, I did some reading today. I read like a page or two, and maybe you learned something, and maybe we became more familiar with something and had a good time. So, you know, thanks for listening, and keep doing what you do. Keep shining on. All right. Well, I will see you next time. Until then, bye-bye.